Hey guys, tonight we're stepping off the cobblestone path and into the shadowed corners of medieval life. Not the courtly banquets or heroic battlefield legends. No, those are too loud for where we're headed. We're slipping quietly behind the scaffold, where the straw is damp, the axe is resting, and the man who wields it sits alone. You've probably seen him in movies, looming in a black hood, wordless and monstrous. But tonight, we're not watching him from the crowd. We're stepping into his shoes. And let me warn you, you probably wouldn't last. Not because it's gruesome, though it is. Not because it's violent, though it's that too. But because being an executioner in the Middle Ages wasn't about brute strength or how well you could swing an axe. It was about loneliness, ritual, shame. Living on the edge of town and the edge of human tolerance, doing the job no one wanted to admit needed doing, and sleeping at night with the knowledge that you ended a life because someone told you to. This isn't the fast-paced history of kings and crowns. This is the slow, whispering story of the man who stood alone in a square full of people, the one everyone stared at, but no one saw. So if you're still with me, take a breath. Put your phone on silent. Dim the lights. Maybe let the soft hum of a fan settle in beside you. And let's begin our long walk through a life most people only glanced at once, before looking quickly away. The first thing you should know is that being a medieval executioner wasn't a job you applied for. No one walked into the village guild hall, tapped the job board, and said, "I'd like to behead criminals for a living." No, it often chose you. In some towns, it was a punishment passed down from father to son, a mark left like a bruise on the family name. If your father was an executioner, odds were good you'd become one too. Not out of legacy, but because no one else would hire you. The shame was inherited. So was the isolation. Your house would sit on the very edge of town, not just metaphorically, but literally. The last cottage before the fields took over. You wouldn't live near the blacksmiths or the cobblers or the cheerful hum of a town square. You'd live near the lepers, near the tannery, near the pigs, near the places people liked to pretend didn't exist. And people wouldn't talk to you, not really. Oh, they might nod at you if they needed something. They might give you a coin or some meat as part of your wage. Yes, executioners were often compensated in goods, not just money. But they wouldn't invite you to dinner. They wouldn't sit beside you at church. If they had children, they'd pull them close when you passed, as if your shadow might stain their soul. You were a reminder that death had hands, and those hands lived in the same town as them. You'd rise before dawn, always before dawn. The town would be sleeping, except maybe for a stray dog or a half-drunken watchman making his last pass. You'd sharpen your blade, and not just once, over and over. The axe wasn't some thick, dull lump of metal like Hollywood might suggest. It was precise, thin-edged, balanced. You'd oil the handle, check for cracks, test its weight in both hands. You'd practice the swing, not wildly, but in calm, deliberate arcs. You had to know the exact force. You had to know how the blade would fall and how deep. Because a botched execution, that wasn't just messy, it was dangerous. The crowd might turn on you, and if the condemned suffered, they'd blame you, not the judge. You'd probably be poor, not starving, but not comfortable. The town gave you just enough to survive. Sometimes there was a fee per execution, sometimes a stipend, sometimes just whatever food the market vendors didn't sell. You might moonlight as a skinner, a knacker, or a tanner. Or perhaps you'd collect night soil, human waste used for fertilizing crops. These were the only jobs considered beneath your primary one. And at home, if you had a family, they carried your burden too. Your wife might be the only woman in the village no one would barter with. Your children, if they went to the parish school, might be sat alone. In some towns, they weren't even allowed inside. Guilt by association, even when the guilt was nothing more than doing your job. Some nights, you'd walk past the square where it happened, the scaffold still dark, the boards creaking in the wind. You'd feel it in your bones. You'd remember the faces. Not the ones from 10 years ago, the ones from last week, last Tuesday, yesterday morning. You'd remember the weight of the axe, the feel of bone under steel, the thud that silenced a crowd. And maybe, if you were like some of the rare few who wrote about it, you'd remember the eyes, because they looked at you right before the end. Some spat, some wept, some just stared, and you were the last thing they saw. There's a journal entry, barely legible, from a 14th century executioner in what is now Germany. It's little more than a few lines, scribbled on parchment meant for grocery lists. But it reads, "He asked me if it would hurt. I said no. I lied." Not out of cruelty, but because that was your job, to make it quick, to make it clean, to lie when lying made it easier, and to carry the truth quietly back to your home, where no one would ask you about it. Let's say you are called to perform. The bell rings. Not a normal bell, but a deeper one. The kind that doesn't call people to prayer, but to watch. A public execution was a kind of event, you see. And the people came. They brought children. They sold baked goods and ale. It was justice turned into theatre. A scaffold was built, often the day before, and it smelled like fresh wood and sweat. The crowd pushed close, but not too close, just near enough to see everything. You waited off to the side. You didn't speak. You didn't smile. You didn't shout. You were just there, like a statue that had learned how to move. Sometimes you were allowed to drink before, mead or ale, something to steady your hands. Not too much. You needed focus. Your job wasn't to scare. Your job was to end. When the condemned was brought out, a thief, a murderer, a political rival, you'd take your place. The priest would say a few words. Sometimes the condemned would too. If they begged, it made people uneasy. If they were silent, it made them heroes. You learned not to listen, or maybe you learned too well. And then, the moment. The part people don't talk about. Not the swing, not the blood, but the space between. The moment where the crowd holds its breath, where the birds stop singing, where your hands tremble just slightly and you push the thought down because you've done this 100 times, but it never quite feels routine. The wind brushes your cheek, the axe rises, and then silence, then noise. But by the time the noise comes, the gasps, the cries, the occasional cheer, you're already stepping back. You clean the blade, quickly. You let the guards handle the body. You nod once, maybe to the priest, maybe to no one. And you leave, not through the crowd, but around it, always around it. There are records of executioners being pelted with stones if the job wasn't clean. One English record from the 1470s tells of an executioner who was chased into the woods after a beheading took 3 swings. The people called him a butcher. They wanted a new one. They didn't ask if the man had flinched or if the blade had cracked. They just saw the mess. It's funny, in a way, how little kindness there was for the man doing the kingdom's dirtiest job. He was necessary, they'd say, but unholy. They'd pray for justice, then curse the man who delivered it. He was expected to be efficient, solemn, strong, but not proud. Never proud. Pride was for knights, for lords, for men whose hands didn't shake in the dark. And yet some did take pride. Quietly, they kept their axes clean. They studied anatomy. Yes, even in the 14th and 15th centuries, executioners in some regions were expected to know where to strike, how to avoid bone splintering, how to cause the least pain. A clean execution was a mark of professionalism. In France, certain executioners became well known. In Germany, some were even consulted on wounds and injuries, like grim surgeons who happened to work in reverse. But even the best still lived alone. There's a documented case of a man in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, who performed over 200 executions in his lifetime. He kept a small garden, grew lavender and onions. His diary said he spoke to the plants more than to people. One entry, faded but clear, read, "They do not fear me. They do not ask what I've done." So what happens when you try to stop? Can you just walk away? Rarely. The job sticks. If you leave, the name stays. People remember, they whisper, "You're the one who killed the merchant's cousin. You're the one who swung the axe at the young girl accused of witchcraft. You're the one who laughed, even if you didn't." That's the thing about being an executioner. People remember what they think they saw. Retirement wasn't dignified, it was just quiet. Maybe the town lets you go, maybe they don't need you anymore. Maybe you grow older, slower, and the new priest wants a younger man. You don't get a ceremony, you get forgotten, unless they need you again. And so your life drifts from one square to another, from one name to another. Sometimes you're recorded in town rolls, sometimes not. Sometimes you disappear completely, as if the job swallowed you whole. And maybe it did. Because let's be honest, would you have lasted? Would you have woken each morning with steady hands, knowing what waited? Would you have eaten alone, day after day, without bitterness? Could you have raised a family, knowing your children would bear the mark of your profession? Could you stand in the square and feel 100 eyes watching, judging, blaming, and still lift the axe? Would you have seen a young man kneel, terrified, and still taken his life without letting your own voice break? Maybe not. But someone had to. Someone always had to. So when you think of the medieval executioner, try not to picture the hooded villain from a film. Picture the man sitting at a wooden table, sharpening a blade by candlelight. Picture him looking out the window at a town that won't look back. Picture his hands, rough, practiced, trembling just a little, and understand, if only for a moment, what it means to be necessary and utterly alone. And with that, we step softly into the next part of our journey. The tools, the precision, the almost surgical weight of duty, because ending a life wasn't just physical, it was technical. And in Chapter 2, we're going to explore the instruments of that final mercy, but not too quickly. Take a deep breath. Stretch your fingers. Let the hum of the fan settle into your thoughts. And when you're ready, we'll continue. So now that you've stood where he stood, and maybe felt, if only faintly, the cold breath of judgment on your neck, we can begin to look more closely at the things that surrounded him, not the people, not yet, but the tools, the objects, the instruments that were never displayed proudly on a mantle, but always waited, quietly, like obedient ghosts in the corner of a dimly lit room. Most people imagine that the axe was the beginning and the end. One swing, one tool, one brutal act of severance. But that's far from the truth. If the executioner was merely a bringer of death, then yes, perhaps one weapon would be enough. But in truth, he was more than that. He was a ritualist, a technician, a symbol. And for each role, he needed the proper tools. Some practical, some ceremonial, and some, strange as it sounds, more for the living than for the dying. Let's begin gently with the most famous of them all, the axe. Not the crude, monstrous thing depicted in films with jagged edges and clumsy weight. No, a true executioner's axe was refined, sometimes taller than the man himself. Often broad, with a crescent blade that flared out wide to maximize precision. The steel had to be clean, smooth, and sharp enough to part skin and bone in a single stroke. But more than that, it had to be balanced. Too heavy, and it became unwieldy, dragging the arms off target. Too light, and it would lack the force to finish the job. Executioners learned over time to feel this balance in their palms, to test the heft by swinging it in the quiet hours before dawn, when no one was watching, when it was just the axe, the still air, and the thought of what it would do. Some made their own axes, forged them in secret or bartered with local smiths who understood the need for discretion. These craftsmen might not want to be seen speaking to the executioner, but they understood metal, and they knew, just like the executioner did, that a blade made poorly wasn't just a risk to the condemned. It was a risk to the one holding it. There were times when the axe wasn't used at all. When the sentence called for hanging, drowning, or burning, the executioner's role shifted. He became a facilitator of mechanisms, a setter of ropes, a stoker of fire. But still, his tools mattered. Consider the rope. Not all ropes were equal. A rope too coarse could abrade the skin, tearing rather than restraining. A rope too thin might snap, turning a hanging into a horror. Some ropes were waxed, others oiled. The length was calculated based on the weight of the condemned. Too short and the neck wouldn't break. Too long and the head might be severed unintentionally. This was called the drop, and in time there were charts and tables used to determine the correct length, particularly in later centuries as executions became more standardized. But long before that science, it was experience. The executioner might test a rope by pulling it taut across a beam in his home, or by suspending a weight similar to a man's body. It was trial and error, but the error could be catastrophic. There were other tools too. The sword, used in some places instead of the axe, particularly in noble executions. Because the sword carried a kind of dignity, the axe didn't. It was associated with knights, with warriors, with the battlefield. To be executed by sword was, in a twisted way, considered more honorable, less butchered. In Germany and parts of Switzerland, sword executions were common. The executioner would carry a two-handed sword, often ornate, though not used for combat. It was blunt along the edge, sharpened only near the point of contact to ensure control. These swords were designed for one thing only: the clean removal of a head from a kneeling body. But even swords had their nuances. In some cities they were blessed, in others they were named. One sword in Nuremberg, used across multiple generations of executioners, was etched with the phrase, "I punish with justice," a strange sort of righteousness for a tool of death. There were branding irons too, heavy metal rods ending in letters or symbols, heated until they glowed red in the coals, used not just for criminals, but for those who were spared death, but marked forever. A thief might bear a T on their palm. A woman accused of infanticide, a symbol over her chest. The executioner would perform these tasks silently, quickly. A brief hiss, a brief scream, and it was done. He would carry irons in a cloth bag, sometimes with initials carved in wood, so he wouldn't mistake one letter for another. These tools were often hidden away, kept beneath floorboards or behind walls, brought out only when needed. There was no pride in branding, only necessity. Let's slow down a moment now, because we're approaching something heavier, not in the weight of iron, but in the weight of meaning. The block. The execution block wasn't always used. In many places, condemned individuals knelt on the ground or even lay flat. But the block, the square, blood-darkened slab of wood, became iconic. A place where the condemned laid their head, waiting for the end. Some blocks were simple, a few planks nailed together, stained with time and use. Others were ornate, carved with patterns or symbols, especially if used for nobles. Imagine for a moment the preparation of the block, the cleaning, the wiping away of blood, of flesh, of hair. Sometimes sand was scattered at its base to absorb what spilled, sometimes flowers were laid there by relatives, and sometimes, after the crowd had left, the executioner would sit beside it for a while, not to reflect, not to mourn, but to breathe, to let the silence return. There are records of blocks being reused for decades, passed from one executioner to the next. Some believed they absorbed the memory of death, that their dark grain held the last thoughts of those who died on them. Superstition, perhaps, but when you spend your life surrounded by endings, a little superstition can keep you sane. Then there were smaller tools, knives for dismemberment when needed, hooks used in certain punishments for public display, chains, manacles, items not used in every execution, but kept close, just in case. And we can't forget the ledger. Yes, the executioner kept records, not always formally, not always for the town, sometimes just for himself. A list of names, dates, crimes, sentences, notes. One surviving ledger from the 1500s contains a quiet notation beside a woman's name. Eyes open, did not speak. That's all. No poetry, no drama, just an observation. But even that tells us something, that he saw her, that he remembered. These tools weren't just extensions of the executioner's hand. They were extensions of his burden, each one a reminder of a task performed, a life ended, a role fulfilled, and each one had to be cared for, maintained, stored, hidden sometimes, feared always. But what's most striking about all of this is how meticulous it was. We tend to imagine the executioner as a brute, a man driven by violence, but in truth, many of them were closer to surgeons. They understood anatomy, they practiced angles, they memorized joints, muscles, tendons, they studied how bodies moved and how they stopped moving. One English executioner wrote in his journal that he practiced on livestock, pigs mostly, not to desensitize himself, but to refine his accuracy. The beast's neck is thicker, he wrote, but the resistance is similar. If I cleave cleanly, the man will not suffer. A strange kind of mercy, but mercy nonetheless. In some regions, executioners were actually employed as medical assistants, not officially, but when wounds needed stitching or bones needed setting and no barber surgeon was nearby, people would knock on the executioner's door because he understood flesh, and while they wouldn't shake his hand, they would let him bind their wounds. There's a quiet paradox here. The man most feared for ending life was sometimes the one called upon to preserve it. We move now, slowly, into the ceremonial tools, the things less about function and more about symbolism. The black cloak, rarely worn outside of executions, but important nonetheless. In some cities, it denoted the executioner as an official of the state. In others, it was meant to anonymize him. A theatrical gesture, but it rarely worked. People knew who he was. The cloak wasn't protection, it was costume. And the hood, oh the hood, the one image everyone knows, the black faceless shroud over the head. The truth is, it was mostly a myth. Hoods were rarely worn in real executions. They were impractical. You needed visibility, clarity, precision. Most executioners went barefaced or wore a hat or tied a cloth around their mouth to avoid the stench. The hood, as we imagine it, came later. In plays, paintings, stories, it was an invention of drama, not of necessity, but it stuck. And so we remember the executioner not as a man, but as a shape, as something inhuman. Easier that way, perhaps. Easier to sleep at night if you imagine the axe was swung by a monster, not by someone with a wife, a limp, a favorite song, a memory of childhood. There were also bells, sometimes small, carried by the condemned as they walked to the scaffold, sometimes rung by the executioner himself, a way to clear the path, to warn of the procession. These bells were both ritualistic and practical, but they made a sound, a high, trembling note that could be heard over the crowd. That sound became associated with death, a sound you didn't forget. And when all the tools had been used, when the axe was hung, the rope coiled, the branding iron cooled, the cloak folded, the executioner would sit in silence, perhaps with a drink, perhaps just with the creak of the wood beams in his home. He would oil the axe again, even if it wouldn't be used for weeks. He might stare at the wall where names were etched, not always intentionally, sometimes just scratched into the stone during moments of quiet. A name, a date, a mark. He might dream of blood, not in fear, but in memory. Blood has a way of lingering, even when it's been washed away. And all the tools, they waited, patient, still, silent. They did not question, they did not regret, they did not forget. And that, perhaps more than anything, is why you wouldn't last. Not because of the blood, not because of the weight, but because of the silence, the long, lingering silence of tools that never judge, but always remember. So rest now. You've seen the tools, you've touched them in your mind, you've felt their weight, their shape, their stillness. But next, we turn to the moment itself, the ritual, the performance, the strange, quiet theater of death. So breathe. Close your eyes for a moment if you wish. Let the image of the axe fade. Let the warmth of your blanket replace the cold of the scaffold. And when you're ready, we'll continue. The tools have been laid out, cleaned, honed, the wood wiped free of dust. The blade, now silent, rests on a folded cloth beside a mug of bitter ale, untouched. The executioner has barely slept. Not from fear, not exactly, but from the heaviness of anticipation, which is sometimes worse. Dawn begins slowly in the village. First, a grey haze pressing in behind the shutters, then a narrow slit of silver light carving across the cottage floor. Somewhere nearby, a cock crows, late as always, and the fire in the hearth has nearly died out. But the axe gleams faintly still. It doesn't need heat to shine. Today is not ordinary, even though the air smells the same, even though the bread, half stale, is eaten the same way, with calloused fingers, no butter, no salt. Even though the same steps are taken across the yard to check the knot in the rope coiled beneath the shed roof, it is still not ordinary. Because today someone dies, not from plague or famine or childbirth, not by accident nor quiet old age. Today it is chosen, structured, agreed upon. Today it is done before a crowd. And the one who does it? He does not smile, he does not speak, he simply dresses. There is no dressing room, no ceremonial robe laid out on polished wood, no mirror, no servant, just the small space in the corner of his cottage where a long dark tunic is hung from a rusted nail. It is the same one he wore last time, same stitch near the hem where it once tore against the scaffold edge, same faint crease where he folds it over his knees while he waits. He slides it on slowly, ties the belt, pulls his hair back if it's long. Some wear gloves, some don't. He does. The smell stays on your skin otherwise. And the crowd always watches the hands. You can almost hear them already, not close, not yet, but stirring. Doors creaking open, feet crunching across frost-bitten grass, wooden carts pulling toward the square. The day is beginning, And so is the ritual. The scaffold was built yesterday. In most towns, it's done quickly. A handful of men, some boards, a hammer, a bucket of nails. It's not meant to last. That's part of the design. Temporary stage for a permanent act. But even so, it's sturdy. It has to be. There's weight to carry. Not just of bodies, but of attention. And everything about it matters. The height, for instance. Not too tall, not too short. High enough to see the act from the back of the crowd, but not so high as to seem regal. The condemned must be visible, but not elevated. This isn't theatre, they'll say. But of course it is. The executioner arrives before the crowd gathers, always early. He walks quietly, carrying his axe in a simple sack. Not hidden, not displayed, just there, like firewood or bread. Something ordinary, if only in shape. There's no applause, no greeting. If the guards acknowledge him, they do so with a nod, maybe a grunt. He nods back. They don't speak. Not here. Not now. He lays the axe down behind the post, stretches his fingers, rotates each wrist, checks the platform with one slow step, just one. Enough to know it won't groan. Then waits. The condemned isn't here yet. That part takes longer. They might be in the jailhouse praying or refusing to pray. They might be silent or screaming or bargaining with priests, guards, even the rats beneath the straw. There's no universal behavior in those final hours. Some grow quiet, some fall apart, some accept, a few, a rare few, laugh. But most don't. There is very little laughter left at the end. The crowd thickens now, slow at first, then faster. The first to arrive are the older ones, those with stiff knees who want to sit on crates near the front. Then come the merchants, their aprons still dusted with flour or soot. Then the mothers, holding children by the hand, telling them this is what happens when you steal. Then the boys, always the boys, clustered together, faces eager, eyes alight with anticipation. And at the edges, the quiet ones, standing behind the crowd, watching not the scaffold, but the man beside it, watching the executioner. He watches back, without meaning to. Their eyes never linger, but they always find him again. He adjusts his grip on the belt, wipes his thumb on his sleeve, looks at the sky. Clear today, no clouds, easier that way. Rain makes the boards slick, makes the rope stretch, makes everything slower, and slow is bad. The priest arrives next, short, round, sweating already, a book in one hand, a crucifix in the other. He nods to the guards. They nod back. No one nods to the executioner. And finally, they come, the condemned. It could be anyone, truly. A man with a curled lip and shackled hands. A woman with hair matted to her cheeks, whispering to someone who isn't there. A youth barely out of boyhood, blinking against the light. A noble, dressed finer than the crowd, but walking just as slowly. A mother, a beggar, a soldier, a priest once. Even a child in the old days. Not common, but not unknown. They come led by guards, sometimes 4, sometimes more. Surrounded, but not touched. The guards let them walk on their own, if they can. It's easier that way. No dragging, no bruising, no chaos. Just the steps. Each step brings them closer to the scaffold, and the closer they get, the quieter the crowd becomes. A strange silence, heavy and expectant, like breath held in a tight throat. The children stop pointing, the merchants fall still, even the boys, the loud chattering boys, fall silent. Because this is the moment, and the executioner steps forward. He doesn't bow, doesn't speak, just moves. 1 pace, maybe 2, to show he is ready, to show that this isn't personal, but it is deliberate. The priest mounts the platform first, mumbles the rites, offers a final confession. Sometimes the condemned accepts. Sometimes they spit. Sometimes they say nothing. And the executioner, he listens, not to the words, but to the tone. Is this one afraid, angry, proud? How will they hold themselves when the time comes? It matters more than you think. A defiant body strains. A panicked one trembles. A resigned one sags like cloth. The condemned is positioned. If it's an axe, they kneel. If it's a sword, they may stand. Some are blindfolded, some refuse, some ask to speak. In England, it became common for the condemned to address the crowd, to confess, to declare innocence, to ask for prayers. It became part of the ritual, a final act in the play. The executioner does not interrupt. He waits, hands loose at his sides, eyes never quite meeting theirs. It's better not to look, easier not to see. When the moment arrives, when the words end, when the priest steps back, when the crowd leans forward, that is when the axe is lifted. Not yet swung, just lifted, and time stretches. You cannot imagine how long a moment can last until you've stood in it with a blade poised and 100 people watching. He breathes. Once, twice, then the swing. There is no fanfare, no slow-motion drama, just the dull sound of steel through flesh. Sometimes one strike, sometimes two, very rarely more. And the body slumps, or falls forward, or simply drops. And for a moment, no one moves. The priest begins a prayer. The guards step forward. The executioner steps back. If it was clean, he nods. If it wasn't, he doesn't. He does not stay to watch them carry the body. He does not speak to the family. He does not collect applause. He simply gathers the axe, places it back in the sack, and walks away. The crowd begins to disperse, quickly, as if embarrassed. The market opens again. Bread is sold. Ale is poured, and the square is swept. But not cleanly, never cleanly, because blood seeps into wood, into memory, into the way people glance at the scaffold the next day and don't mention what they saw. And the executioner? He walks home, slowly, avoiding eye contact, avoiding reflection. At his door, he pauses. Sometimes he enters, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he keeps walking, down to the stream, or the woods, or the edge of town, where no one follows. And there, alone, he breathes again, feels the ache in his arms, the sweat on his neck, the silence returning. The axe is still warm. There's more to say, of course, about what happens next, about the rituals after death, the handling of bodies, the burial, or lack thereof, but not yet. For now, rest. Let your breath slow. Let the image fade. And when you're ready, we'll move into the space between endings, the life the executioner returns to, the quiet that waits after the crowd has gone home. You've seen the axe rise. You've watched the body fall. You've stood in the hush that follows when justice, or something resembling it, has been served before a silent crowd. But what happens now? What happens when the last stone of the square has dried and the screams have been swallowed by bread sellers shouting again and the rumble of cartwheels creaking through town? What happens when the performance ends and the actor no one applauded walks home with a sack heavy on his shoulder and his name thick in every whisper? This is what they never show you, the hours, days, and years that live in the hollowed-out spaces between executions, the life of the executioner, the part of his existence that isn't about blood or blades or final breaths, but the long, drawn-out living that comes after them. Because the truth is, he isn't always swinging. Most days, he doesn't kill anyone. Most days, he lives, quietly, separately, among people who will never quite let him forget what he's done, or more precisely, what he might be called upon to do again. So he wakes, not like others, not with a stretch and a smile, not to the laughter of children at the hearth or the knock of neighbours wanting to borrow eggs or gossip about the weather. He wakes the way one does from half-sleep in a dark wood, cautious, still, already alert. His dreams are short, but never kind. Sometimes he dreams of rope unravelling, sometimes of looking into eyes that refuse to close, sometimes he dreams of nothing at all. That's the worst kind, the dreamless, weightless kind. It means the body is trying to forget what the mind still carries. He washes. Not with fresh soap most days, but with cold water from the well behind his home. There is a bar of tallow soap tucked into a tin, but it's saved. Used only after the axe. Because the smell, the real one, clings. Under the fingernails, behind the ears, between the knuckles. Even after days, it stays. His home is small, humble, even for a tradesman. The walls are of wattle and daub, patched where necessary with stolen wood or discarded stone. The roof leaks, the door sticks in the summer. But it is enough. It is more than most would give him, and its location is important. Not at the town's centre, not on a tidy lane near the chapel or the blacksmith's square. It's always peripheral, a few hundred yards off. Past the last cart, past the last bakery window, past the reach of clean laundry hanging from window ledges, near the pig pens, near the refuse pits, near silence. In many towns there were laws that dictated how close the executioner could live to others. In Nuremberg, he was allowed within the city walls, but not within the markets. In some French communes, his home was marked on maps with red ink, a warning, not a label. In others still, he was forbidden to walk on certain paths, to enter through certain doors, even to bathe in the public baths at the same time as other men. So he lives on the edge of town, of law, of what people are willing to tolerate. It's there, in that strange in-between, that he forges the rhythms of his day. He begins with tasks, feeding the goats, checking the snare lines set in the brush beyond the wall, fetching water if it didn't rain, cutting kindling if it did. These are normal things, quiet things, things anyone might do, but even these are touched by his shadow. The butcher doesn't sell to him unless he sends a child. The tailor will mend his coat, but only if the cloth is dropped off in secret, before dawn. The baker gives him yesterday's loaves, still edible, still warm in the center if soaked in broth, but she doesn't look him in the eye. She leaves them in a cloth bag by the door, tied with a red ribbon. Always red, always the same one. And when he walks, to market, to the chapel, to the edge of the river, he feels them, the eyes. Some avoid him, others stare too long. No one says his name. Children are the worst, or maybe the most honest. They point, they whisper, they giggle behind dirty hands. Some dare each other to touch the hem of his cloak. Once, a boy spat in front of him, as if to prove something. Another boy took a chicken bone from the butcher's bucket and held it like a tiny axe, mimicking the swing, laughter trailing behind him. The executioner didn't stop. He didn't speak. He just kept walking, because he knows. He knows what they think, that he's cursed, unclean, monster, necessary, a reminder that death is not an idea, but a man, with a back that aches in the morning and dirt beneath his nails. He passes the church sometimes, or enters if the hour is right. But he stands at the back, near the door, not always by choice. In some places, executioners were banned from full sacraments. They could not confess, could not take communion, could not be married in the chapel, or buried in consecrated ground. The church taught mercy, but the law demanded punishment. The executioner, caught between, was tolerated, never embraced. Priests varied. Some would nod, some would offer blessings, quietly, without contact. Others turned their backs entirely. One even preached that the hand which holds the axe could never hold salvation. That death, when given deliberately, blackened the soul. The executioner didn't argue, but he didn't forget. His home, sparse as it is not entirely empty. There are books, if he is lucky or literate. Not many. A psalter, perhaps. A ledger, maybe a herbal. There are tools, small blades, whetstones, iron tongs, and there are memories, hung without nails. A strip of cloth from a condemned noblewoman's sleeve. She kissed his hand before she knelt. A coin pressed into his palm by a farmer whose brother had stolen a goat and lost his head. A ribbon, red, left behind after an execution that had drawn a crowd larger than the harvest festival. He does not keep these things to celebrate. He keeps them because forgetting is harder than remembering, and because he must live in the space between acts of death. Because killing is not the whole of his life, it's just the part everyone sees. What else does he do then, in those long days between? He works, not just as an executioner, that is a title, but not a full wage. He renders fat, he collects the dead animals from the roadside and burns them. He digs ditches, he helps tan hides, if the tanner will let him. He sharpens blades, his own, but also those of farmers too afraid to look him in the face, yet too poor to refuse his price. In some towns he is the dog catcher, in others he cleans the cesspits, in others still he is called upon to break apart bones for burial, limbs from plague victims too swollen to move whole. It is always work no one else wants. It is always work that leaves the hands raw and the eyes lowered, and sometimes, very rarely, he is asked to heal. You see, executioners knew the body intimately, not in textbooks, but in sinew and cartilage and tendon. They knew where arteries ran, where joints failed, where pain lived. Some became skilled at setting bones, sewing wounds, lancing boils. There are records, real ones, of executioners who were midwives, herbalists, tooth pullers. A contradiction, perhaps. The man who ends life also preserving it. But life, in the Middle Ages, did not live in clean categories. Sometimes the only hands willing to touch a wounded man were the same hands that had touched death. And so he works, and he eats, not well but enough. Boiled root vegetables, day-old bread, dried meat, ale when he has coin, water when he doesn't. He eats alone, mostly, sometimes beside a fire, sometimes on a step, watching the wind move the grass along the ditch, sometimes with his dog, if he has one. A few had wives. It's easy to romanticize that part. The woman who looks past the fear, who sees the man beneath the cloak, who loves without shame. But those stories are rare. Most women avoided the executioner, not from hate always, sometimes from fear, often from pressure. To lie with him was to be tainted. To marry him was to share in his curse. Some did, though, out of need, or loneliness, or a kind of stubborn grace. They kept the house, raised the children, waited at the gate when he walked back from the scaffold. Some refused to attend executions. Others watched everyone. They lived, too, on the edge, with the same red mark on their doors, the same whispers in the market, the same space left empty beside them in church pews. And the children? They grew, played, ate, dreamed, but not like the others. They were watched, mocked, avoided, called butcher's spawn, gallows brats, demon seed. In some places they were forbidden from apprenticeships, couldn't join guilds, couldn't wed. The stain followed them, like blood on a hem that never washed out. Some ran, changed their names, disappeared into cities where no one knew. Others stayed, took up the axe, because legacy is a strange thing, and the only place you're not outcast is in the house of another outcast. So the executioner lives in the pauses, in the cracks between violence, in the slow rhythm of chores and bread and silence. He tends a garden, keeps herbs for wounds or seasoning or superstition. He carves, not saints, not devils, just shapes wood into something less lonely. He listens to the wind, to the river, to birds that never fly too close. He waits because the bell will ring again, because the letter will arrive, because the guards will knock, because someone somewhere will stand before a judge and hear the sentence, and when they ask who will carry it out, they will say his name, and he will rise, sharpen the blade, wash the tunic, clean the nails beneath his thumb, and walk the road alone, because that is his life, the life between deaths. And so we return to the present. You, laying there, eyes heavy, breath soft, a little further from waking now than when we began. You've walked his roads, seen the faces in the crowd, felt the ache of his arms and the cold of his mornings. You've carried his silence, and yet we are not finished. Because after the axe grows dull, after the hands grow slow, after the face becomes more memory than man, there is still an ending left, a final chapter in a life spent at the edge. So rest now if you need, stretch, breathe, let the hum of the night find you. And when you're ready, we'll speak of the last thing they never tell you. What happens to the executioner when there are no more executions left? The life the executioner returns to, the quiet that waits after the crowd has gone home. And so we arrive at the end, but not the kind that falls with a thud on old wooden boards. Not the one marked by the lifting of a blade, the rustle of a crowd, or the sudden silence that presses down just before a life leaves a body. No, this end is different. It's slower, quieter, less about what is done and more about what is no longer being asked. No more names scrawled onto wrinkled parchment. No more guards knocking on the crooked door. No more blades to clean. No more ropes to hang. Just time, long and unbroken, stretching out like mist across a field no one walks anymore. You see, even the most feared man in town doesn't swing the axe forever. There is a day, and it always comes, when the hands become too slow, the shoulders too stiff, the crowds too unfamiliar. And when that day comes, the executioner becomes something else. Not retired, not revered, just discarded. It begins subtly, the way all endings do. First, the town doesn't send for him. Then the magistrate delays. The bell doesn't ring as often. And when it does, someone new arrives in his place. Perhaps it's a younger man, a cousin, a stranger from another town. Perhaps it's someone who watched once and didn't flinch, or someone desperate enough not to ask questions. But whoever it isn't him, and he knows. Because there's a silence that follows that first absence, and it's a different silence than the one after a death. This one settles inside the bones. He still wakes early out of habit more than need, still boils the same water, eats the same bread, sharpens the same knife, but the edge doesn't need to be that sharp anymore. The bread is staler than usual, the water colder. He watches the road, but no one comes. And for a man who was never embraced, the absence of being needed feels like something worse than hatred. It feels like erasure. Sometimes the executioner fades quietly. His home becomes overgrown. The door rots. The children, if he had them, move far away, never mentioning what their father did for coin. The town forgets, or pretends to. Other times, the old executioner lingers, He walks to the edge of the square on execution days, even if he's not called. Stands far from the scaffold, watches the crowd, watches the new man raise the axe, watches the way people cheer or don't, watches the way no one looks at him anymore. He is a ghost in his own town, and yet he lives, because endings, even for men like him, do not come quickly. They arrive in pieces. First, the pension is denied. There were no such things in most towns, no formal end-of-service payment. He might be given a coin, or a goat, or a sack of grain. More often, he is given nothing. In Nuremberg, a letter survives from a retired executioner, dated 1613, pleading for a small allowance for meat and milk on account of his service. It is not signed with his name, it is signed, "He who served." In another town, the widow of an executioner was denied burial beside her husband because she had washed his blades. There is a strange cruelty in the way a town uses a man to enforce its law, and then turns its back on him the moment his usefulness rusts. The old executioner feels it in the way people pass by, the way their eyes slide over him as if he's not quite there, as if they might catch his shadow like a sickness if they look too long. And so he retreats, he becomes quieter, walks less often into town, grows his beard, lets the garden go untended, eats whatever is left, drinks more when he can afford it. He becomes part of the landscape, like the moss on the north wall of the chapel, present, not remarked upon, but he remembers, oh yes. He remembers every name, everyone that knelt, everyone that cried, everyone that looked up at him in the last breath of their life and gave him something, anger or forgiveness or fear. He carries them, not because he wants to, but because no one else will. You see, the executioner was the last witness to many lives, not just their deaths. Their last words, their last requests, their final moment of dignity or despair, and as the world forgets them, he does not, because who else will? He keeps records, sometimes, not officially, but in the way that old men keep stories, scratched into the beams above the hearth, carved into the table where he takes his meals, muttered to the dog asleep at his feet, names, dates, a sigh, a whisper. In the absence of ritual, the mind creates its own, and so he keeps vigil for ghosts. Not all executioners died lonely, but many did. Some were buried in unmarked graves outside the churchyard, outside the walls. In Paris, it was tradition to bury the executioner at night. No bell, no prayer, only dirt and dark, and the soft creak of old wood as the casket settled into the earth. In other places, they weren't buried at all. They were left in the execution fields, the same soil where blood had soaked for years. Returned to it, one final silence, unmarked, unmourned. But not all endings were that quiet. Some old executioners became legends, strange ones, stories told in whispers at taverns. He still walks the woods, his axe still swings at midnight. Don't look at the man by the well, he'll curse your family. The line between fear and folklore is paper thin, and the executioner who once stood as a man becomes something else. A warning, a shadow, a lesson for children not to misbehave, and maybe he prefers that, because if they fear him, they remember him. Better that, perhaps, than being forgotten entirely. But let's return to the quiet ones, the real ones, the men who did not seek the role, who did it anyway, and who died as they lived, on the margins. There are a few we know by name. Franz Schmidt, for example, the executioner of Nuremberg from 1578 to 1618. He kept a journal. He recorded every execution he performed, every person he beheaded, hanged, broken, burned, over 300 entries, and his writing was not cruel. It was clinical, measured, almost sorrowful. He wrote of a girl he executed for infanticide, described her confession, described how she wept, and then simply executed with the sword. All went well. All went well. As if that mattered. As if well was the best that could be hoped for at the end of a life. But maybe it was. Franz retired, lived out his life in relative comfort, a rare thing. He became a healer, treated wounds, wrote medical texts, and perhaps, in his twilight, he slept more peacefully than most. But he was the exception. Most executioners, when they stopped, simply disappeared. Their homes collapsed. Their names faded, their tools rusted, their ghosts lingered, and their story, their full, complicated story, was left to be misremembered, as villains, as monsters, as hoods and axes and blood. But now you know better. You've walked beside him, you've seen his house, smelled his hearth, watched his hands shake as he tied a final knot. You've heard his silence. And maybe if you listen closely, you can still hear it now, the hum of memory, the weight of names, the long, slow echo of a life spent at the edge of every law, and beyond the reach of every comfort. The executioner does not leave behind a statue. He leaves behind a question. What is justice? What is mercy? What does it cost to deliver them? And what is left of the man who did? Let's return now to the executioner's home. Not the one in his prime, where the tools were always polished and the axe rested near the door, and every dawn held a small, tight breath of preparation. But the home after, where dust settles, where wood softens, where the light changes and no one knocks anymore. If you stepped inside now, you wouldn't see a monster. You'd see a man who sits in silence longer than he speaks, who moves slowly, deliberately, because there's nowhere left to be. The hearth is dark most mornings. He lights it only when the cold becomes unbearable. There are fewer books, fewer boots, fewer sounds. Sometimes there are chickens or a single goat. Not because he needs them, but because they are company that does not ask questions, company that doesn't flinch. He tends the garden less. The herbs go wild, mint strangling the rosemary, feverfew curling along the path. And he doesn't mind. Wild things keep better company than townspeople anyway. But still, there are days when he tries. He dresses carefully, puts on the old tunic, now patched, now too loose across the shoulders. He brushes his boots, walks slowly into town. And that's when he knows it for certain. He is no longer feared, no longer hated even. He is simply invisible. The market buzzes without pause. No one glances up. No one whispers. He isn't pointed at. He isn't watched. He is passed by, as if air, as if he were never there at all. For some, this would be freedom. For him, it is another kind of death. Because being feared meant being remembered. And now? Now there is nothing. In some towns, this is when the real end begins. The executioner, long retired, long forgotten, becomes the village drunk, or the muttering man on the hill, or the one children dare each other to touch. He begins to talk to things that aren't there. To the axe, still hung in the shed. To the rope, still curled in the corner. Or to the ghosts. Because the names do not leave. Not ever. He might mutter them while stirring broth. Or while tying the gate shut for the night, or while sitting beside the fire, whispering to shadows only he can see. Sometimes he speaks them aloud, as if he's reciting prayers, not for himself, but for the ones who were never prayed for. You'd be surprised how many of the condemned were never given last rites. too poor, too hated, too soon taken. And so he gives them his own, not with Latin, not with incense, just with a voice, low, even, remembering. He says their names as if it makes them real again, because someone has to. The town changes, time moves forward, a new church is built, a bakery opens, people forget there was ever a scaffold in the square. The blood is gone, the wood replaced, the laughter louder. But a house still sits on the edge of it all. Its roof is sagging, its door still sticks, and inside there is a man who once bore the law on his shoulders like a second skin, who once held death in both hands, who once stood between the world and its hunger for justice. And now he just waits for the end that does not announce itself, waits for the ache to settle into his bones, waits for the morning he does not rise. And when that day comes, there is no bell, no ceremony, no black cloth over the door. Sometimes a neighbor finds him, sometimes no one does. The animals are sold, the house is emptied. The axe, if it still exists, is thrown into a river or hung in a tavern as a curiosity. And that's the last anyone speaks of him. But still, the echo remains, not loud, not sharp, but soft, like wind through pine, like rope brushing against a beam, like a voice half remembered. Because every town carries its ghosts, and this one carried yours. And yet, long after he is gone, his presence lingers. Not in the way of kings or saints or poets, whose likenesses are carved in stone, whose words are copied in ink and gilded borders, whose lives are recited in halls where no blood was ever spilled. No, the executioner remains in a different way. In the gaps of a town's memory, in the scaffold beam reused to build a barn, in the rusted iron loop beneath the floor of the jailhouse, in the faint reddish stain on a stone step that won't quite wash away, no matter how many rains come. The place he lived, if it still stands, becomes something else. Maybe it becomes a storehouse or a shed, or collapses entirely, covered in ivy and moss, its roof swallowed by time. Children dare each other to go near it. Some say it's cursed, others just say it smells like rot. No one says his name, but they know somehow that something heavy happened there, that someone lived there who watched too many people die, that someone made it possible for the town to forget what justice really looks like when it's carried out by human hands. The role of the executioner is gone now, at least in most places. The axe has been put behind glass, the rope kept in museum drawers, the scaffold turned into a diagram in a textbook. But behind all of that is a man, just a man, tired, taught to be silent, asked to carry a burden most would never touch. And now, as we reach the end of our time with him, it's worth asking ourselves something. A question that cannot be answered with ink or law or history. What do we owe the ones we ask to do what we ourselves will not? Do we honor them? Do we fear them? Do we forget them? Or do we finally see them? Not as hooded monsters, not as villains in a crowd's imagination, but as men, flawed, lonely, used, men who knew what it was to take life, but perhaps never fully understood what it meant to live their own. It's a strange legacy, to have no statue, no marked grave, no portrait, only a name written once in a dusty ledger next to someone else's, with the word executed scratched carefully beside it. And yet, the executioner is still here, not in flesh, but in memory, in every legal ritual that still bears echoes of his work. In the formalities of justice that try awkwardly to make clean what is never clean, in the way we talk about crime and punishment and what is fair, he is there, unseen but not entirely gone. And now that you know him, not just the blade, but the man, Perhaps you'll remember, not vividly, not loudly, but gently. When someone speaks of justice, you might hear the quiet scrape of a whetstone. When someone says he got what he deserved, you might see a man walking home alone, covered in the weight of a death no one thanked him for. And when someone asks what it means to serve the law, you'll know that sometimes it means being buried without a name, because your name was never yours to keep. And so we end where we began, not with blood, not with violence, but with stillness, a man, a house, a memory, the executioner finally at rest. You've walked his life with him, seen his hands, heard his silence, felt the years slip past like candle wax left to cool. And now you may sleep, because that's the last gift he gives, the quiet truth that even those closest to death can still make space for reflection. So turn down the lights. Let the hum of your room settle around you and carry this story with you into your dreams. Not as a horror, but as a whisper. Thank you for listening tonight. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, you are safe and you are not forgotten. Good night.